its neighbor to the north across the Arabian Gulf, that had so consistently violated every undertaking that it had made in connection with its nuclear program, that if the UAE and if the 123 agreement that the United States was to sign with it could be used as a model, then there was some prospect that we could continue the dual track of peaceful civil nuclear power with, if not no risks of proliferation, at least minimizing the risk. So it was quite disturbing when, after the UAE came forward after their agreement, that the administration announced that perhaps that the gold standard that they had referred to was more a more flexible, that's the word I think we're looking for, a more flexible standard that would be applied on a case-by-case basis. Well, look, the practical reality, the politics of this are very, very plain. Whatever the UAE's rights to insist, if anybody else gets a less restrictive agreement, that they could reclaim the possibility of enrichment and reprocessing. As a matter of politics, it's simply not sustainable for other countries in the Middle East to have relations with the United States that give them more flexibility than the UAE. So I think it's inevitable, again, politically, that you would have a race to the bottom, that we would see the possibility of restraining the spread of enrichment and reprocessing technologies would simply disappear. And it wouldn't just be in the Middle East, it would be worldwide. Now, this is far from a hypothetical concern in terms of potential breakout capability for nuclear weapons programs. We've already seen Secretary of State Clinton has said, she's quite right, that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it is simply a matter of time, and not much time, before Saudi Arabia gets nuclear weapons, before Egypt gets nuclear weapons, before Turkey gets nuclear weapons, and quite possibly others in the region as well. So that in a very short time, as these things go, 5 to 10 years, you could have half a dozen or more new nuclear weapon states in the Middle East. I think what this demonstrates is that we really are on the verge of seeing the entire nuclear non-proliferation regime collapse. It's got a lot of pressures. This is not the only one by any stretch of the imagination. But it is absolutely certain, in my view, that if the United States doesn't hold the line, nobody else is. And while many people have said that ultimately you can rely on IAEA inspections, you can insist on the additional protocol and get even further rights of inspection for the IAEA, its record over the years and the practical limitations that wannabe nuclear weapon states can impose limit its effectiveness. Quite apart from the fact that the IAEA has been pretty good at limiting its own effectiveness over the years through its unfortunate selection of directors general at different points. Now, I'm very happy that the current director general actually takes the threat of proliferation seriously, at least from Iran, and that the agency has performed well. But you can't count on that inevitably, and you can't count, as we have not been able to count these past several decades, on actual compliance by NPT and safeguard signatories. So when you see Congress trying to do what the Lehtinen and Berman legislation would do, just one step to reaffirm that as a government policy, the United States feels strongly about trying to minimize the breakout risk, the risk of proliferation, the example that is set by countries that are simply not serious about the commitments they make on the proliferation side. This is something, it seems to me, ought to be pretty straightforward. I mean, ultimately, what you need is executive branch policy that's unambiguous on this point. Because when you look at a case-by-case review, you're talking about no standard at all. I think that's the inevitable consequence. So this, to me, is a case study in whether, on a bipartisan basis, we're able to impose discipline on ourselves to achieve the objective that we all say we want, which is to restrain the threat of nuclear proliferation. Right now, we are failing that test. We're failing it in a lot of respects in North Korea and Iran. I could go on, but this is one that is uniquely in our control. We set our own standards, and if we're not prepared to set this standard, then it's not hard to imagine how the negative consequences will cascade away from us on this point. So I was very glad that Congresswoman Lehtinen was able to appear and discuss some of the specific concerns with respect to her bill. We still have time this year. I understand the political situation here on the Hill, but every once in a while something sneaks through on a bipartisan basis, and I would hope that this would be one of the things that makes it, because by the time we have an election in November, however it turns out, it may be too late in many cases, and this whole effort legislatively may be entirely overtaken by events. I like to try and be optimistic on this. I'll just close with this note. Again, when you see the possibility of cooperation like we have on this, I think it should give us some encouragement that if we could get people to focus on the issue, we could see a path to success. And I hope that has persuaded all of you here today to try and work with us on this, but I do appreciate your being here. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think with your indulgence and the panel's indulgence, maybe I'll take a couple of questions. I think Chairwoman Lehtinen had to go, so I'll give her answers too.
Show of hands.
So we've persuaded everybody. Well,
yes, that's great.
It's definitely time to leave now. Yes, sir. We'll take a risk here.
You need to stand up, identify yourself, and speak up.
I'd like to give a view on the upcoming negotiation in Baghdad. If the administration is willing to consent with the 3.5 to 5%, what do you think is going to affect the whole thing that you expect?
Well, questions about the upcoming negotiation between the Perm 5+1 and Iran and Baghdad, and what may or may not happen on reactor-grade enrichment. Look, I don't think the government in Tehran has the slightest bit of credibility on anything regarding their nuclear program, and I think a tacit, even an unspoken concession that the regime can enrich to reactor-grade level, 3 to 5%, so long as they close down Fordo, simply legitimizes a program that's been in violation of repeated Security Council resolutions since 2006. It undercuts the basis on which the EU3 began their negotiation with Iran over my objection, I might say, back in 2003. It's 10 years of the European Union saying the basis for a deal with Iran was suspension of all enrichment-related activities. And if you give that up, even tacitly, even as saying, well, this is just a partial agreement, you've locked the Iranian position in very advantageously, and I think everybody familiar with this knows once you're enriching to reactor-grade levels, you're doing almost 70% of the work you need to get to weapons-grade levels. So it's the idea that it's okay to go to 3 to 5%, but just terrible to go to 20% is a charade, and it's discouraging that after all these years of negotiation, and again, even as recently as yesterday in the New York Times, watching senior Iranian officials boast again about how they've taken the West to the cleaners to buy time for their nuclear program and how much they, in effect, have already legitimized, I would think would be a wake-up call. I guess we'll have to wait and see in Baghdad.
You persuaded.
Okay, well, thank you again. I just want to underline, and I will have to depart, but I want to underline what Henry said. This is a very important issue, and I think that's why for NPEC and FPI to have this event is significant, and significant that all of you are attending it. So thank you very much.
You may be asking, where is Congressman Markey? Well, his closest aide says, we're trying. The markup is kind of nuts there. That's a cue for us to proceed to the second panel. And In any case, before we move to the second panel, I'd like you to recognize that the pile of goods that you were given actually has something of value in it. To start off, there are 2 FPI documents, a op-ed by Robert Zarate and testimony by Jamie Fly on the subject. Well worth reading. The op-ed is about an op-ed, which means it's a hyper op-ed. It's about the Markey op-ed. In this regard, although we don't have copies of it, there is a letter that Kingston Reif's organization put out, which is bipartisan, about the gold standard. And it was a letter that was sent to the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I recommend you go to his site. It's got to be there. Or it will be soon, right? It's not. Okay. In addition, you'll notice that we reached out to other organizations. There is a piece by Jody Lieberman that I recommend that is in there. It was posted on CSIS, and it talks about what the impact of sticking to the gold standard might be for industry, and uses a historical lens by looking at what previous efforts to promote non-proliferation did to industry, and what industry claimed, and what in fact happened. It's a very, it has footnotes. There could be a quiz. Then there is a letter which FPI and NPEC worked on, which is signed by a fair number of Republicans, including Steve Hadley, John Bolton, Mr. Joseph, which talks about the need for the president to reconsider going away from the gold standard. It's a partisan letter. It was meant to be, but a Democrat could have signed it. Finally, and perhaps of greatest interest to me, there is today a release of a new document, and it's Serious Rules for Nuclear Power Without Proliferation, and it's in that package. It will be the subject of a meeting Friday, which you are all invited to, at the Carnegie Endowment, by Victor Galinsky and myself. It represents about 2 years' worth of work. There's lots of unpublished research that went into it. If you will, it's a blue sky document for if you took a look at civilian nuclear energy the way you look at nuclear weapons, and you wanted to reduce risks, and you put that first, what would your policies look like? We rather work from the premise that we're going to have an expansion of nuclear power and then ask the question, what can we do to limit the risks? This reverses, puts security first. It's a different perspective on where you end up. Now, with no further ado, I've asked Jamie to take over and moderate the second panel, so we'll get right into it now.
Thanks, Henry. I really appreciate Henry's and NPEC's work on this issue. I think Henry, in large part, has been one of the people who's helped bring this debate to where it is today. At FPI, we're very proud to co-host this event. We'll start the panel. I think if Congressman Markey arrives, we'll make time for him to speak. I want to introduce the panelists. I'll just make some brief remarks, and then I'll turn it over to them. To my left is Daryl Kimball, who is Executive Director of the Arms Control Association, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to effective nuclear, chemical, biological, and conventional arms control measures. Prior to his time at ACA, he was the Executive Director of the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, and has a long career working on arms control issues. To his left is Kingston Reif, who is the Director of Nuclear Non-Proliferation at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, who has also worked in this field for quite some time, including as a research assistant on the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission from 2008 to 2009. And obviously, I think Henry needs no introduction at this point. Before I turn it to Daryl, I'll just say that I became interested in this issue when I was serving in the Bush administration at the Pentagon and at the NSC, working on counterproliferation. And I just saw that despite the best efforts, I think, of officials like Ambassador Bolton and others in the Bush administration, there was still kind of an institutional think I would describe this as, in the legislation that's been discussed, as a bipartisan solution to what I truly believe is a bipartisan problem. This is not a problem with the Obama administration. It was an issue in previous administrations of different political parties. And I think if we are to avoid some of the nightmare scenarios that Ambassador Bolton spoke about in terms of a cascade of proliferation, that taking, I think, very rather minor steps, quite frankly, with legislation like this makes a lot of sense. I'll just highlight two aspects of that. I think the Chairwoman did a good job of highlighting the key parts of her legislation. I mean, I think from my perspective, it's just a common sense approach. There's no reason that Congress could not and should not have the opportunity to take an up or down vote on all agreements that do not conform to the so-called gold standard that's been discussed. I think this is especially important given, and you need to read the press reports about all the various countries that are interested in nuclear energy and interested in negotiating these agreements with the United States, especially in key regions like the Middle East. And beyond what's already been said, I'll just add that I think people sometimes don't realize that when you're working in negotiating any agreement, whether it's an arms control agreement or an agreement like the 123 agreement, the U.S. government bureaucracy really could use some external forces putting requirements on them, because especially when it comes to a debate about our regional interests with a particular country or our broader political relationship with a certain country, there's going to be an inherent bias, I'd say, within the U.S. government bureaucracy to ignore the concerns of the non-proliferation experts and promote the concerns of the regional bureaus of the State Department. And I think that if they know that Congress has laid down clear red lines and there are certain things that are required of an administration to get an agreement through Congress, I think that will only strengthen their ability to negotiate. Otherwise, I think these sorts of concerns are far too often disregarded and discarded quickly in the negotiation process. The last point I'll just make, beyond what's already been said, is that on the industry aspect, and I'm sure Henry will talk about this as well, but he's much more of an expert on this than I am, I've just been struck as an outside observer that the arguments that I've heard put forward at times really imply that somehow we think that the U.S. nuclear industry should be allowed to just chase after every potential market that opens up. I fundamentally question in many cases whether some of the countries that have expressed interest in nuclear energy actually even require nuclear energy, and so I think we need to be careful about creating a situation where we're actually encouraging the nuclear industry to just chase after each exotic market without doing some real analysis of what is in the U.S. National interest. I do think that as well, this notion that somehow that the U.S. nuclear industry will be left behind if they do not have the flexibility to basically operate wherever they'd like is again not how we should be building our policy. There are other countries like Russia and France and South Korea which are active in this area. I do think though we should be, our approach should be to try to be leaders in this field and in this sector, trying to shape international norms and guidelines rather than just falling behind countries like Russia and France and others who are willing to set or not willing to abide by any standards or just willing to follow only very low standards. And then one final point I'll make, and again, this is someone who's not an expert on the industry, but I've been struck in my travels in the last several years, even to places like Central Europe, where we have very close allies, which I've been told, are seeking bids to build nuclear reactors. And on one trip a year or two ago, I heard a lot of complaints from several Central European countries about that U.S. companies were not even very active in those bidding processes, which I find just kind of ridiculous, given that we hear from the nuclear industry that the latest and greatest market is in a proliferation-sensitive region is where they need to operate if they're not serious about actually competing with Russia and France and others in areas that we do not need to be as concerned about proliferation, and countries that we have less concerns about them actually seeking nuclear weapons. And so I suggest that they should focus on those regions first 5 minutes for each speaker, and then we'll take Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jamie, and thanks to Henry for bringing together this unusual group of people. I can say that I could not have done this. I could not have brought myself together with John Bolton, but Henry could bring me together with John Bolton on one panel. So, and there is, I think the representation here today, shows that the problems we're looking at are problems that the nation faces. They require bipartisan solutions, and on this issue, like a lot of others, we need to look at the facts and the issues and try to work together. So, look, as many people have said already, the U.S. has long sought to improve international safeguards and standards to prevent the spread of the most sensitive dual-use nuclear technology, particularly enrichment and reprocessing technologies. And Bill 1280 seeks to improve, that we've been talking about, seeks to improve the U.S. Atomic Energy Act and the 1978 amendments that have set important global benchmarks for the terms under which the U.S. and others should enter into peaceful nuclear cooperation agreements. And for many years, as a matter of policy, the United States has sought to prevent the transfer of enrichment and reprocessing technology, which can be used, of course, to make nuclear bomb material. And as several people have said already, with the renewed interest in nuclear energy, and given that the last time the Congress revised the Atomic Energy Act and these standards for nuclear cooperation is now 20 years old, I think it's clearly time to, one, update the U.S. standards for civil nuclear trade to raise the barriers against proliferation, and two, to ensure that those safeguards apply to all states with whom we negotiate so-called 123 agreements. And as Chairman Lehtinen said, I think this bill would give Congress a greater say in that process. Greater say meaning a much more significant role in approving those agreements that don't conform with these standards. Now, as we've heard, the current Obama administration policy to pursue nuclear cooperation agreements appears to be on a case-by-case basis with respect to the enrichment and reprocessing, the pledge not to pursue enrichment and reprocessing. And that creates an uneven set of standards and a mixed message about what our goals are, and it creates problems. And I think that is a mistake. As Jamie said, this is a bipartisan problem, however. It's not a problem that began with the Obama administration. And as we saw with the ill-conceived U.S.-India nuclear cooperation deal, which Henry and I worked against and to improve, we've seen how the exemption created for India from the global non-proliferation rules has given others a cynical excuse to break the rules. Pakistan, China, and to lobby for their own exemptions. And we've seen how that agreement has not led to new action by India to improve its non-proliferation record. They're doing the same thing they were doing before the deal. So it's time to consider a better way. And H.R. 1280 provides, I think, a very useful way forward. It's not perfect, but it's something that the Obama administration should support in principle and work with Congress to improve. And I'd like to highlight a couple of things that I think are particularly important about it. It would add several new requirements to the 9 requirements already in Section 123A of the Atomic Energy Act. And there'll be a quiz afterwards about what those 9 requirements are, so get ready. But among the most important new requirements that would be added are the application of the IAEA additional protocol to the list of requirements. We got to remember that despite the limitations of IAEA safeguards, and there are limitations, these safeguards improve our ability to detect diversion. And there's still dozens of states that have not yet approved an additional protocol, including Algeria, Egypt, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia, whose ambassador to Washington recently threatened that his country would build nuclear weapons if it does. The bill would also require, or it would also incorporate the idea of a pledge not to acquire enrichment and reprocessing capabilities as one of the standards that we're trying to put into these agreements. I would also suggest the bill could be strengthened with a couple of things by clarifying that the recipient state must allow the application of comprehensive safeguards according to the latest modifications. Iran what is called Code 3.1, the most recent revision, which makes it harder for the agency to do its job. The other thing that could be useful would be to require, not just give the President the option to terminate agreements, but require the termination of U.S. nuclear cooperation in the event that a recipient state conducts a nuclear test explosion, is found to be in blatant violation of its IAEA safeguards, or acquires enrichment or processing equipment from sources other than the United States. So, critics of this bill have said, well, you can't require states not to pursue enrichment and reprocessing. That is their right under the NPT. That is their option. Well, it doesn't specifically require them to renounce, but it creates an incentive for those that do by creating a fast-track mechanism for consideration of agreements that meet that standard and some of the other standards listed in the bill. Those states that enter into agreements with the United States that don't meet those standards would be subject to a more rigorous process requiring affirmative congressional approval. So, to take this back a step, Article 4 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty gives states, non-nuclear weapon states, the right to pursue peaceful nuclear technology so long as they meet their Article 1 and 3 safeguards, Article 2 and 3 safeguards obligations. But the United States has a right and a responsibility, I would say, and an interest not to engage in civil nuclear trade with states that don't meet a higher set of standards than those spelled out in the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is itself nearly 50 years old. So some nuclear energy industry lobbyists also suggest that because states will not want to give up their option, even if it's only theoretical, to pursue enrichment or reprocessing in the future, this bill, if enacted, would put U.S. industry at a disadvantage, and because these states would seek nuclear cooperation agreements with other suppliers, France and Russia, that might not try to build these conditions and these incentives into the agreements. I think that's far-fetched, and I think it suggests to me that some would want to simply lower the standards that we have and the globe has in order to give companies and special interests a perceived competitive edge. And I don't think there is a competitive edge if this standard were to be worked into U.S. law. We've got to remember that just last year, the Nuclear Suppliers Group adopted a new rule in June 2011 that bars enrichment and reprocessing transfers to states without comprehensive safeguards agreements that have not joined the NPT, that do not have the additional protocol in force, or to states in proliferation-sensitive regions. What that means is that it's extremely unlikely that anytime in the near future, the medium term, and the long term, are any of the nuclear supplier states possessing this technology going to transfer enrichment and reprocessing technology or equipment to these other states. Makes it unlikely, it's not impossible, but I think that means that the claims that the gold standard, if written into U.S. nuclear cooperation law is going to create disadvantages is just not correct. So if we're to succeed in persuading countries to adopt these rules, all states, and particularly the United States, must be willing to provide greater leadership and also restraint. In the future, I think we can all agree that there's no strong economic rationale for any state to acquire enrichment technology to get into the commercial business. There's already a glut of uranium on the market. And in most cases, if you look through the history of proliferation and non-proliferation, it has been so-called peaceful nuclear programs that have involved enrichment or processing that have eventually turned into nuclear weapons programs. So we need to be extremely on guard. We need to raise the standards in this particular area. So I think it's time for the Obama administration to take another and more open look at this. I think it's time for the Senate to take a serious look at this, and for Congress to move forward to begin to look at this bill and revise it if necessary and put it into law. Thanks.
Thanks, Daryl. We'll turn now to Kingston Reif.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Daryl, for your remarks, and thanks a lot, Henry, for putting this panel together. I really enjoyed working with you on this issue. over the past couple of months, and hope we can continue to cooperate. I wanted to begin my remarks by stating that, in my view, the real gold standard that we ought to be striving for is a world in which all countries agree not to make their own nuclear fuel, and the number of locations where fuel is made for civilian power reactors is kept to the smallest number possible and operated on a multinational basis. Now, to borrow a phrase, this is an ideal that may not be achieved in my lifetime, but it's a goal worth striving for if we mean what we say about the dangers posed by the existence, production, and use of highly enriched uranium and separated plutonium. It is through this prism that I evaluate the merits of a case-by-case approach to civilian nuclear cooperation and enrichment and reprocessing. And in my view, this approach does not bring us closer to this goal. In fact, it is a step backwards, I think, for the following reasons. First, I think consistent standards are important. If other countries believe that the U.S. is not serious about maintaining consistent and high non-proliferation standards in its nuclear cooperation agreements, then they will not assume additional commitments that will not be asked of others. Second, the policy could prompt the United Arab Emirates to renegotiate the terms of the UAE agreement, which includes a pledge on part of the UAE not to enrich or reprocess. And third, I think it's an open question whether a case-by-case approach will lead to increased business for the U.S. nuclear industry relative to an approach that insists on higher standards. In any event, the search for additional profits for the U.S. nuclear industry that may not be forthcoming should not come at the expense of core U.S. non-proliferation objectives. For these reasons, the serious national security and proliferation implications of a case-by-case approach warrant close congressional scrutiny. In fact, an interesting body of work in the academic community in recent years suggests that all types of civilian nuclear assistance, to say nothing about the transfer of ENR, actually increases the likelihood that states will begin nuclear weapons programs. More research needs to be done in this area, but Congress should be particularly cautious in evaluating proposed cooperation with countries that face significant security threats. Many of the countries beginning nuclear programs in the Middle East fit this category. H.R. 1280, many of the details of which have already been described here today, is an important step in the right direction in terms of strengthening Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act. As others have noted, the bill would not prevent other countries from forever pursuing enrichment or reprocessing, but by requiring that Congress approve agreements that do not contain a no ENR pledge, it would strengthen the U.S. hand in negotiations on civil nuclear cooperation and create incentives for states considering nuclear energy to choose not to pursue sensitive fuel cycle technologies. The administration and the nuclear industry have lined up in opposition to H.R. 1280, as Daryl just described. And one common argument in opposition to the legislation is that by requiring more stringent standards, it would border on denying NPT members their right to explore the full nuclear fuel cycle. But the U.S. has never supported the argument that parties to the NPT have an inherent right to acquire an ENR no matter what. The U.S. also has an obligation, especially in light of the growing interest in nuclear power around the world, and particularly in some unstable regions of the world, to not simply race with Russia, France, and China the lowest common denominator. Another argument is that by requiring tougher standards, other countries will not agree to nuclear cooperation with the U.S., thereby weakening our ability to influence their non-proliferation behavior via such things as physical protection standards, consent rights, and more. But there are ways to provide incentives and exercise influence that do not hinge solely on nuclear cooperation agreements with less stringent non-proliferation standards. Building on these points, I think the U.S. argument in favor of strong non-proliferation conditions in nuclear cooperation agreements is strengthened when the U.S. practices what it preaches. In that light, as Daryl described, U.S. support for a special exemption for India has hurt U.S. credibility. So too is the administration's recent proposal to support USEC with $150 million to develop a domestic, national security-related enrichment capability. The fact that the U.S. can rely on foreign companies to provide its enrichment services is a strong rejoinder to claims from Iran that it needs to produce its own nuclear fuel instead of relying on the international market. Speaking of Iran, and I'll end with this, lest I don't say something that Henry and Jamie may disagree with, Some have argued to me that we can't tell other countries not to make their own fuel if we cut a deal with Iran that allows them to do so. While I believe that an endgame that allows Iran a limited capability to enrich to 3 to 5% under strict international supervisions is not an ideal outcome, it is certainly better than war, and Iran has made it abundantly clear that no enrichment is a non-starter. But cutting a deal with Iran obviously does not mean a U.S.-Iran agreement on nuclear cooperation. The issue we're addressing today has to do with nuclear trade with the U.S. We can maintain a policy of high non-proliferation standards with respect to U.S. nuclear cooperation with other countries, even if the P5+1 doesn't block the Iranians from enriching fuel themselves. With that, I'll turn it over to Henry.
I think the last comment brings to mind a remark of my grandmother, who has long since left the scene. You should be so lucky. I think what it is the Iranians are going to agree to anytime soon is not much. Stay tuned, it could be wrong. But it is a fair point that you do need to disconnect whatever we're doing with Iran from whatever we are going to be doing with future nuclear cooperative recipients. And it's a fair point. And on that we agree. Now, I'd like to just make two kinds of remarks. One, why Congress needs to get more involved. I mean, after all, there is an executive branch review. Shouldn't that be enough? And who better to know what to do than the executive? Surely they are in command of this topic much better than the folks on the Hill. They have all that expertise. Well, a little history, a little law. I come to this topic having studied constitutional law for 3 years at the University of Chicago Graduate School. It shouldn't go entirely to waste. This was delegated power. Where did the executive get this expertise and authority to move forward without congressional votes on what is a trade agreement? Well, it was delegated in 1954 under the Atomic Energy Act. Now, we were taught back at the University of Chicago that what you delegate, you can take back. I don't think anyone has contradicted that there or anywhere else that teaches constitutional law. And there is cause to take things back. I mean, in 1954, we were in a psychological warfare race to put out small research reactors faster than the Soviets. This was to win hearts and minds. It's gotten a little different. We're not sending out zero-power research reactors anymore. We're talking about cooperation on reactors that make, in the first 18 months, roughly 50 to 75 bombs worth of near bomb-grade plutonium. It's called fuel grade. It makes very good weapons. You can read about this on our website. We've had some bomb designers talk through what the quality of this material is. In any case, it's different. Now, that is the past. Why now? What's the problem now besides the advance in technology? I've served on a commission, the Commission to Prevent WMD Proliferation Terrorism. I got it right. One of the things we looked at Code Word was the quality of analysis done by the interagency on what's called the Nuclear Proliferation Assessment Statement, which was done and is done under law so that the lawmakers can get a sense of whether the nuclear cooperative agreement is appropriate for the given recipient. We looked particularly at the assessment done of Russia. You can go to the Government Accountability Office's reports on this. Let's just say that the Commission violently agreed with how subpar that work was. Why is that of some moment? Well, it was that agreement which passed or came into force without the Obama administration bothering to even send a witness to a hearing up on the Hill. By the way, one of the reasons the Chairwoman is so exercised about this issue is she was not amused by that, and I don't blame her. But it was legal. Time to change the law, perhaps. There also was an agreement with Turkey. Congress, something's gotten a little lax here. And that is the key reason it probably makes sense to change the law. Now, the second point that I would like to talk about, and that will be the last, is the practicality of leading with regard to standards. The argument that is made today, which was made in 1978 when similar suggestions were made to raise standards for nuclear cooperation, is, well, if we get ahead of everyone else, we'll be left behind. The argument roughly is not that different from the British argument about the slave trade in the 1700s. We need to be in the trade to control it. Now, Secretary Shultz was confronted with this argument. He said, not really. And he was right. The Jody Lieberman piece, which is in that package, explains that when we set our sights on saying that there ought to be controls over even dual-use equipment in the nuclear suppliers group, and that we should start controlling that, and that we should get others to. The argument was, well, we'll never get agreement from the others to do it. When I worked in the Pentagon, I presided over the agreement by the nuclear suppliers group to do precisely that. Now, it took a while, but it didn't take forever. The argument then would be made, well, how in the world are we going to leverage the behavior of the other suppliers? Let me give a couple of suggestions just to show you your future if you choose to try to lead. Let us just say in the case of Japan and the ROK, they are close allies. In one case, there is a real questioning of how much nuclear power is going to be developed, at least in Japan. And there is a key concern about proliferation in Japan. The ROK, meanwhile, needs to get a nuclear cooperative agreement from us. Why? Well, some of the machines they make contain U.S. technology, and they have to get a consent to re-export it. That, and they want to do the right thing. They are a close ally. That's called leverage. Now, in the case of Russia and France, we have two curious cases of two countries that plan to make nuclear fuel here. Why might they be interested in making sure that nuclear cooperative agreements are struck easily, quickly, and without interference or second guessing? Well, they may not be able to sell all of their nuclear fuel that they might make here at Eagle Rock in the future. I don't know where the Russians, Rosatom, might make theirs. Maybe they'll take over USEC. Looks like a good candidate. In any case, they want to be able to export. And that is a controlled item that cannot be exported without a nuclear cooperative agreement. I suspect, although I don't know, that both of these entities, or at least one, is very keen on this legislation being defeated and has perhaps worked its magic up here as much as it can. But let's be candid. The French are getting an appropriation every year to build a facility down in Savannah River worth several $100 million. They're a close ally. They're going to be making reactors probably here at some point. That's called leverage. And the Russians, well, they need help. They always need help. And they want our technology. That's called leverage. I would suggest that leading and using leverage would produce the same result as it did for the nuclear suppliers group, if we choose to lead. If we don't, oh well, the race to the bottom is always there. It's a lot easier. But I would suggest it's not half as much fun, and it won't result in as much happiness. I wouldn't recommend that race. But that's what we're being told we must settle for.
Could someone speak specifically to Jordan? I understand that they have a large resource of uranium, 20,000 tons. They've now narrowed down their selection of vendors to two, Russia and a joint French-Japanese venture. What kind of leverage, and I understand that they're not willing to follow the UAE in giving up enrichment or the processing. What kind of leverage can we apply specifically to Jordan? What should we do to Jordan?
Henry, do you want to start?
Well, there are two ways to look at this. There's the happy way and the sad way. Let's start with the sad way.